the record told him, quote, "There are only 3 possibilities for the Snowden heist." The Snowden heist. There are only 3 possibilities, and I'm quoting this verbatim. 1, it was a Russian espionage operation. 2, it was a Chinese espionage operation. Or 3, it was a joint Sino-Russian operation. The reason why I love that so much is because the obvious meaning of it is we have absolutely no idea what this was, but we are determined to malign him, and so we will simply say anything that we can in order to do that, no matter how evidence-free and irrational it is. And this is one of the amazing parts about this claim, which today persists. You hear all the time that Edward Snowden is a Russian spy. There's so much evidence that negates it. Beginning with the fact that when he was in China and he was being accused of being a Chinese spy, he was forced to leave the country by the Hong Kong Chinese authorities. Not exactly the kind of treatment typically expended by China to a Chinese spy. And then when he got to Moscow, he was trapped in the international airport for 5 weeks while the Putin government negotiated with the American government over things they might get in return for handing Snowden over to the U.S. Not exactly the treatment typically accorded by the Russian government to a Russian spy. But the most important fact negating this claim is that Edward Snowden isn't in Russia because he chose to be in Russia. He's in Russia because he was forced by the United States government to be there. While he was flying from Hong Kong to Moscow, and he was intending to fly to Moscow in order to transit through on his way to Havana and then on to Ecuador, where he wanted to seek asylum. While he was in the air, Hong Kong to Moscow, the United States government just unilaterally revoked his passport, just declared it invalid. Did you even know that the U.S. government has the authority to do that? They can just wake up one day and decide that they're going to just revoke your passport, even if you're out of the country, and then it becomes instantly invalid. No due process, no charges, nothing needed. So when he got to Moscow, he was incapable of leaving, and the United States government had bullied the Cubans into rescinding their offer of safe passage so that he could no longer transit through Havana. So first they trapped him in Russia, a place he never chose to be, and then used the fact that he's there as proof that he's a Russian spy. I mean, this is the contradiction that lies at the heart of this smear. But there are so many other things that just prove that he's a spy, including the fact that if you think about all the things that he could have done with this archive, such as sell it for tens of millions of dollars to multiple intelligence agencies around the world and been extremely rich for the rest of his life, or if he were motivated by malice, he could have simply secretly transmitted it to adversary governments around the world. He did none of that. What he did instead was come to journalists and well-regarded media outlets and ask us to vet the material and publish that which was necessary to inform his fellow citizens, which he views not just as Americans, but people in the world, of what was being done to their privacy in the dark. It was classic whistleblower behavior. The reason Edward Snowden did what he did is because, as a pure act of conscience, he did not want to spend the rest of his life knowing that he had confronted this extraordinary injustice, and that he had it in his own power to do something about it, and then did nothing because of the fear of what would happen to him. When I asked him over and over in Hong Kong what his motive was, what I ultimately concluded was the reason he did it was because the pain of having to live the rest of his life knowing he did nothing about this was so much worse than anything the U.S. government could do to him, including putting him in prison for the rest of his life. It was so obviously an act of political conviction, an act of sacrifice in defense of political ideals that he has long claimed to believe in. One of the things that I realized about the smear campaign is that it is not simply a matter of a bunch of hacks or loyalists to the U.S. government trying to demonize anybody who meaningfully challenges the U.S. government. There's definitely a lot of that going on. But there's something more profound, I think, which is that the people who have decided that there must be some hidden, malignant motive that drove him to do what he did, that he's a Russian spy, or maladjusted, or angry, or alienated, or any of those other things, are doing that because they simply can't believe that anybody can really take any meaningful self-sacrificing action in pursuit of or defense of political convictions and a sense of justice. And the reason they think that is one that reflects so much more about the accusers than it does about the accused. The reason they don't believe that Edward Snowden can take action in defense of political convictions through an act of conscience is because they, these media elites and government elites, themselves have no political convictions. They have no conscience. They themselves would never take any self-sacrifice. As a result, they believe that nobody else possibly can either. And that's the reason why every time there's a whistleblower or a dissenter, there's an instant search underway for what their true malicious motives are, because there's a belief on the part of the people who are soulless and who have no convictions that everybody else is plagued by those same afflictions. So I want to talk about one other myth that I found really interesting and repugnant at the same time, but interesting as well. And this is one that's really common as well, which is that Edward Snowden did what he did because he is a fame-seeking narcissist. The thing that struck me and that amazed me when I went to look back at the political discourse that arose in the immediate aftermath of our story about this was a phrase used over and over and over again, verbatim, by a huge array of political pundits. I mean, I'm somebody who, if you had told me 2 years ago or 3 years ago that you believe that there's some kind of centralized message planning on the part of media elites, I would have told you that I didn't believe that. I think the reason they all end up saying the same thing is because they're basically herd animals who just repeat what they're hearing from other people like them, not because there's any coordinated planning, but the extent to which they all latched on so quickly to the same script, he is a fame-seeking narcissist, almost made me reconsider that criticism about that theory. And you can go and look, it was so fast, within 48 hours, we unveiled the identity of Edward Snowden on June 10, 2013. Go and Google this. Within 48 hours, a huge number of prominent pundits, David Brooks of the New York Times, and Bob Schaefer, the host of Face the Nation, and Richard Cohen, the columnist for the Washington Post, and Jeffrey Toobin, the legal analyst for CNN, all instantly concluded that they were capable of psychologically diagnosing this person that they had never seen before and knew nothing about. Psychologically analyzing and diagnosing him from a distance as suffering from the syndrome of fame-seeking narcissism. Now, there was so much evidence, again, to negate this claim, beginning with the fact that in the very first conversation that I ever had with Edward Snowden, before I met him or even knew very much about him, what he said to me was, I am absolutely determined, and it's non-negotiable, so do not try and talk me out of it. I am determined to come forward and publicly identify myself as the person responsible for these disclosures. And he said he was going to do that for two particular reasons. One, because he felt he owed the world an obligation to explain why it is that he did what he did. And also, he said, secondly, I don't believe that what I'm about to do is wrong. In fact, the opposite is true. I believe it's right. And so I'm not going to hide in shame and bolster the idea that I have done something criminal by lurking in the shadows. I want to come forward and publicly say, here I am, this is who I am, this is what I did, and this is why I did it. But, he told me, the minute that I do that, after I come forward and give that public accounting, I am going to disappear from the media limelight. I'm not going to give any interviews. I am not going to appear on any television shows. I'm going to remove myself from public view. And the reason he decided he needed to do that was because he knew that the tactic of the American media would be to try and personalize the story onto him in order to distract attention away from where he wanted the focus to be, which was on the substance of what the NSA is doing to all of our privacy. And he did exactly what he vowed to do. After we unveiled him as our source and published that video online on June 10th, he did not give another interview for a full year until he was just interviewed in Moscow by Brian Williams 3 weeks ago. And one of the things that is really kind of striking about that is that literally every single day, for almost 6 months. I had every single big TV star. You know those actors who play the role of journalists on television? Every single day, all of them were calling me, pleading with me for an interview with Edward Snowden. He could have been on primetime television every single day for months, been the most famous person in the world, but he deliberately chose not to because he wanted the focus to be on where it's been over the last year, which is on not his personality traits or why he did what he did, but on what this out-of-control rogue agency is doing to our privacy. Really strange behavior for a fame-seeking narcissist to simply remove themselves completely from the public limelight. But one of the things that I actually have thought about over the past month or two is that aside from the fact that there was no evidence for this allegation might be the least interesting thing about it. If you look at how whistleblowers are treated in the United States, going back decades, and not just whistleblowers, but anyone who engages in meaningful, radical dissent, by which I mean not the sort of MSNBC dissent where you like stand up and you say, God, I don't really like this politician, I think I'm going to vote for the other one. That dissent is totally permissible, it's not really even dissent. What I'm talking about is dissent that says that what I have confronted in my own society is so profoundly unjust. And the factions that are responsible for it are so entrenched that the only meaningful way I can confront it and resist it is by breaking the law. Every time there's a whistleblower or a dissenter of that type over the past several decades, they all end up subjected to the same sort of psychological and personality attacks that Edward Snowden was instantly diagnosed as suffering from narcissism. When I was growing up, one of my political heroes, probably my principal political hero, was Daniel Ellsberg, who I'm thrilled and honored. For all of the obvious reasons, all of the reasons that you obviously admire him as well, but there was always something that really confounded me about Ellsberg and about the whole event of the disclosure of the Pentagon Papers, which was, it always mystified me that in response to the disclosure of the Pentagon Papers, the strategy, the tactic of the Nixon administration was to break into the psychoanalyst, the office of the psychoanalyst of Daniel Ellsberg, in order to discover his psychosexual secrets that might embarrass him. And the reason that always mystified me was because it just seemed like the ultimate non sequitur. I mean, think about it. It was like these massive headlines. Pentagon Papers show that the U.S. government has been systematically lying to the American people about the Vietnam War for a full decade, and the Nixon administration's response was going to be, Daniel Ellsberg is a swinger and has some kind of unnaturally intense affection for his sister since the age of 7 that he's resolving in therapy. It never made sense to me why this all had to be accepted. And I remember the first time I ever had the honor of meeting Dan. I asked him about that, and I shared with him my theory that that never made sense to me. And what he said to me was, you are thinking way too rationally about this. That is not how human beings react to revelations. And what he pointed out to me, and I've come to see just how true it is that one of the most effective things that can be done to anybody who stands up and confronts those who wield power is to render them somehow uncomfortable to other people, render them radioactive. And it doesn't really matter how you do it. In fact, sexual revelations or intimate or personal revelations or depicting them as psychologically ill is one of the most powerful ways to do it, because it not only distracts from the substance of what they've revealed, but it makes the person so scorned, such an embarrassment, that other people, good society, decent society, will just want to distance themselves from everything having to do with that person, including the revelations. And you see this over and over and over. One of the most potent examples was the day that the New York Times published, in partnership with WikiLeaks, some of the most extraordinary documents that we've seen in the past 20 or 30 years from the deep secret national security state, which were the Iraq war logs that were leaked by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks. These documents were of momentous importance. I think much more important than even the Afghanistan war logs that preceded them, because they showed extraordinary atrocities committed by the U.S. forces in Iraq and the Iraqi security forces that the US government was training, and all sorts of widespread civilian deaths that were previously unknown. Some of the most important documents documenting true war crimes in the last several decades. And if you look at the front page of the New York Times on the day that they published those documents, what you will find is so extraordinary. There is one article at the top that says something like, newly leaked secret documents show war crimes, or I don't think they ever would call what the US does war crimes, but it was new revelations about the war. And then right next to it, as prominent, if not more so, was a profile on the quirky personality attributes of Julian Assange, written by the New York Times pro-war reporter John Burns, and his article went into all of what John Burns considered to be the strange and weird behavioral attributes of Julian Assange, like he was probably paranoid because he looks around the corner before he enters a new street. Not really that strange a behavior for somebody in the middle of the greatest national security week in U.S. history. That was pretty rational to me. But to John Burns, it was evidence that Julian Assange was paranoid. He slept on the couch. He had really rumpled clothing. He was sort of nomadic. Bill Keller, the executive editor of the New York Times, actually several weeks later revealed to the world the shocking revelation that Julian Assange's socks were actually dirty, and all the way to his knees. And the fact that the New York Times gave equal billing to this hit smear campaign on Julian Assange to depict him as this crazy, insane, freakish person was exactly an expression of this tactic, which is not only to distract from what really mattered, which were the revelations of US war crimes, but to make everybody just want to kind of put WikiLeaks permanently at a distance because of the personal discomfort we were supposed to feel toward Julian Assange, just like the personal discomfort the Nixon administration wanted us to feel toward Daniel Ellsberg, just like the personal discomfort we're supposed to feel for the narcissist Edward Snowden, and just like the personal discomfort that the New York Times tried to get us all to feel toward the other heroic whistleblower of our generation, Chelsea Manning, when they tried to depict what she did. Did as the byproduct of what they called gender disorder, or her struggles with her father. And if you actually read the transcript of the chats that Chelsea Manning had with the repugnant person who served as a government informant and turned her in, you will find, whatever else you think about her and what she did, a model of reasoned conscience and rational assessment. She said she entered the U.S. Army patriotically thinking that the U.S. government was doing good in the world, and gradually over time came to see that it was actually something awful. And she felt as though her fellow citizens and the people around the world had a right to know what it is that her government was doing so that they could engage in debate and have meaningful reform. Exactly the same thing that has happened to Edward Snowden and so many other people, and yet these smears instantly arise that try and make us feel uncomfortable about these dissenters. And I think there's a second point that's more subtle, but even more insidious and more profound about this dynamic that happens over and over again whenever whistleblowers or dissenters come forward, and there's this instant attempt to demonize them and to attribute psychological illness as the real driving force. Implicit in this attack is this premise, and it's actually kind of elusive, but it really is quite potent, which is that the only people who should have their psyches analyzed are those who engage in meaningful dissent. That whenever somebody engages in meaningful dissent, there must be some kind of a psychological affliction causing it. And the reason that assumption is made is because it is based on the premise that our society is so fundamentally good that the only possible explanation that could lead to somebody to believe that they have to engage in that level of dissent is some kind of psychological instability or sickness. That is a really potent message to send. Because the converse of it is that the only way you can prove that you're psychologically healthy is if you acquiesce to the prevailing order. And there's this really important fallacy at the heart of this way of thinking, which is that the only kinds of psychologically significant choices are when you reject orthodoxies and when you dissent from the prevailing order. The reason that's a fallacy is because it may be that sometimes dissent is grounded in some kind of a psychological drive, but it's also just as true, if not more true, that there are serious psychological drives to make people acquiesce or to be compliant or to accept the prevailing order and not to dissent. And this idea that the only people who need to have their psyches evaluated are those who are engaged in dissent is all about obscuring a critically important debate and a really vital overarching question. To me, that overarching question is, who really are the psychologically unhealthy people? Are they the people who work within a nefarious and sprawling, ubiquitous surveillance state who do nothing to expose it? Or is it actually Edward Snowden who comes forward and tells his fellow citizens about what is taking place? Or is the psychological affliction really the thing that makes somebody like Chelsea Manning or Julian Assange or Daniel Ellsberg do things that other people believe constitutes lawbreaking to bring to our attention massive war crimes? Or are they the people within this system who work to perpetuate the war crimes and cover them up and keep them secret? That is a really vital question that this menacing framework of treating dissidents as mentally ill is designed to obscure.